Hey y'all. If anybody's here, if you can hear me, say hi. So I know you're here. Just waiting for a couple of people to join the room or for somebody to say they can hear me. Hi, Shoshana. Glad you're here too. Hey, Bernadette. Good evening. Just giving it another minute or so. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this month we read Tar Baby by Toni Morrison. And before I started talking about the actual book, I wanted to take it back a little bit to talk about the history of the title, because there was an original publication that Toni used to inspire this book that we're talking about tonight. So in 1879, there was the original Tar Baby was mentioned in a book or in a magazine. I'm trying to find the guy's name because just that quick I forgot. Just that quick I forgot who originally wrote it. I left it on a review I just left for the book, but just that quick I forgot who originally wrote Tar Baby. But anyway, there was first publication in 1879, and then in 1888 there was the release of the story about the Tar Baby. So just to give you guys some background, Tar Baby, if you remember the Uncle Remus stories with Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, old African American folklore, and it was, filled with racial stereotypes of how, black people spoke, and obviously how they were perceived or what they thought they would look like. That was the language of the book back then. It's very difficult to read. You got to kind of have to read it out loud to really understand how the language is being used, because it's broken English and all of the things. But anyway, so Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox were in the Uncle Remus stories, but in this particular story, Brer Fox was trying to catch Brer Rabbit. He's trying to catch him in a snare, and he came up with the idea to create this baby out of tar. And it was simply that. It was a mold of tar that he put together. He stuck a hat on it, stuck a coat on it, and stuck it in the pathway. And sure enough, Brer Rabbit comes hopping down the road, and he sees this tar baby. And being, kindly Southern rabbit, I guess, he says howdy to this tar baby. Tar baby doesn't speak back to him, obviously, because he's made of tar, right? And when he realizes that this person that he believes to be a person doesn't want to speak back to him, he's thinking, oh, so you must be stuck up. You're going to speak to me today. You're going to show some respect to me. And he decides he's going to beat some respect into him. And he decides that he is going to punch Tar Baby until the Tar Baby acknowledges his presence and shows him the respect he thinks he deserves. So he punches the Tar Baby, and he gets stuck in the tar. And the whole time he's hollering, let me go, tar baby, let me loose. And he does not let him loose, obviously, because he's stuck in the tar. So he hits him again. And this whole time, the fox is waiting. Or as they say in the book, he's laying low. He's waiting and he's watching. So the rabbit continues to kick, continues to punch the tar baby until he is completely in its grasp. And he can't get loose. And the story ends with Brer Fox coming out from the wood up to this caught rabbit who can't shake himself loose of this tar baby and says good evening. And that's pretty much how the story ends. You don't know if the fox ate the rabbit. You don't know if Brer Rabbit got loose. You don't know if Brer Rabbit talked his way out of that situation. That's just how it ends. So, fast forward 100 years later, Toni Morrison writes Tar Baby. And she takes this story that I just told you about. It's literally a 5-minute read, the original Tar Baby, and she turns it into a love story. And the characters, the main characters in the book, include Jadine Childs, who is a fashion model that went to college paid for by her benefactor, who is Valerian Street, and we'll come back to him. We have Son, who is a sailor who jumped ship in the Caribbean and hid in the streets, Valerian Street and Margaret Street, his wife. He hid in their home. He hid, he was lured into their home by the smells and the scents, and he stayed there getting food in the night when everybody slept, and he hid in Margaret Street's closet until he was discovered. Margaret Street saw him as a threat, while Valerian saw him as something totally different and welcomed him into his home, to his table, to sit down and eat as a civilized man as his guest in his home. We also have Ondine and Sydney, who is the uncle and the aunt of Jadine, who are also the servants, butler and cook, respectively, in the Street's home for 40 some odd years. And these are the main characters in the movie. You also have of the book. You also have Yardman / Gideon, and we'll get back to why it's Yardman / Gideon. You also have Mary / what was her name? Therese, I think her name was. And they also worked on the property. So these characters are the main characters in the book, but the connection between the original Tar Baby and the characters I just mentioned is what kind of makes this whole book really, in my humble opinion, one of the examples of why Toni Morrison is as brilliant an artist as she is. Number one, to take this book or this story that had so many negative connotations to it, this name Tar Baby that has a multitude of racial negative associations with it, and she turns it into something totally different, where the Tar Baby in the story that I just told you about in Morrison's book, that Tar Baby is actually Jadine. And Jadine is considered the Tar Baby because she was created, she is the way that she is because she was exposed to all of these luxuries that Valerian Street allowed her to experience by putting her through school, which led her to going overseas and living in Paris and living this luxurious life that was not at the time something that most Black people got to experience, obviously. And it created into this individual that was not in touch with how things really were outside of the bubble that she lived in. And she was also, going back to Valerian Street, Valerian Street can, very loosely, my opinion, if we're looking at characters that are being recreated in this book, Valerian Street could quite possibly be the character that was portrayed by Brer Fox in Tar Baby, who kind of created this Tar Baby and put her out there to be attractive to other people. I don't know. That's very loose. But most certainly, Jadine was intended to be the Tar Baby. And obviously, Brer Rabbit, the character that wanted nothing more than the Tar Baby's acknowledgement and respect / love, that could not seem to shake himself loose of this Tar Baby, obviously was Sun. Not sure if we ever learned his real name in the book. I think he just went by Sun, and even when Jadine demanded that he tell her his real name, he said his name was Willie, and then something else, and then something else that was on the multitude of Social Security cards that he had. And I don't think it was ever really revealed what his name was, but it didn't even matter, did it? His name was Sun. And this whole story kind of unravels with Sun trying to, not even trying, he wasn't trying to release himself from Jadine, but he was in her grasp from the moment he saw her. From the moment he saw her, where she was so beautiful and so stunning, and he was so aware of his own shortcomings at the time that he couldn't think of anything else to do but to insult her, to make himself feel better. And she beat him. And that's kind of where their connection, his connection to her started. I don't think that her connection started at that moment. I think there was a very specific point in the book where she became attached to him. At least that's how I understood it. But that being said, that is how Morrison's Tar Baby connects to the original publication of the Tar Baby, up to and including the end of the book, where you have Sun being led off into darkness. He can't see. He's in a fog. He doesn't trust his own feet to land securely wherever, when she's telling him, hey, Donna, when she's telling him, go, you have a choice to make now. You have the right to choose now. You have the ability to choose, go. And he has no idea where he's going. He can't see. He's in a fog. And all of a sudden, like, gives me chills when I even think about it. He just takes off running. Lickety-split, lickety-split, lickety-split. That right there is an absolute direct connection to Tar Baby, not only in the lickety-split, in those words, but also in the fact that you don't know what happens at the end. You don't know. It's this ambiguous ending. You don't know if he's running off to Paris to find Jadine still in her grasp, or if he found himself and he's setting himself free and just running. You don't know what happened to him, just like you don't know what happened to Brer Rabbit. So that's the connection between those two books, and the fact, or those two, well, Tar Baby wasn't a book, it was a story, but between the original Tar Baby and Morrison's Tar Baby, just the simple fact that she took that, and I listened to it. I listened to it twice, and it was read in like 5 minutes. Go and listen to it. It's on YouTube. It took like 5 minutes to get through it, but to think that she took that and created this story, mind-blowing. And it just speaks volumes to who she is and how talented and untouchable she is, in my opinion. But that being said, I love the book in the end. I love the book after chapter 4. And I remember saying to my husband, because I don't think I ever read Tar Baby. I knew it. I have it. I never read it. Because I don't remember this story, or at least I don't remember it with an adult mind. I might have read it when I was much younger and was like, what in the world did I just read? And probably didn't get it at all. But I remember when I was getting into the book, I was having the hardest time. I was struggling. I didn't know what they were talking about. It was all over the place. And then I got past chapter 4. And I remember saying to my husband, I don't understand why she took so long to get to the story, to get to why it was so good. And then I watched an interview. There was an interview on YouTube, and I'll link it below if I remember. It's about an hour and 50 minutes where she's speaking at Cornell. And she talks about invisible ink. And I was listening to her talk about invisible ink, and it explained why every single Morrison book I have ever read is so deep that you have to read it once, twice, 3 times. You have to read it slowly. You have to say it out loud. You have to say the words out loud. It explains why her books are the way they are. She used a term that she thought she coined called invisible ink. And this is how she writes her books and how she engages and shares the experience with the reader. And I took notes on this, so forgive me for looking down if I have to. But the invisible ink is what she describes as her writing process, where she knows before she puts pen to paper, she knows what she wants you to get out of that story. She knows the message that she wants to share, but she doesn't know how she's going to get there. She doesn't know how she's going to start it. She doesn't know how it's going to be in the middle. She just knows what she wants to tell you. And the characters, and that's the invisible ink that she writes, that the invisible ink that she uses to write this story, that leads not only the reader, but also herself to this message, to this point. And the characters in her books are never easy characters. They're always characters that have not necessarily lived through something, but survived something or struggled their way through something and came out the other side. So the point that she wants to share with you is never intended to be easily won. It's always going to be something that you have to think about to get it. And that right there, when she said that, it was like this light went off. And I'm like, that is why when we get to the end of Morrison's books and it all comes together and we get what she was trying to tell us, we're just mind blown. We're just done. And it took so long to get there, but that is the intent of why her books are like that. So I wanted to share that because I just said, well, that explains everything, Miss Morrison. That explains everything. So I'm going back to my notes now because I'm starting to ramble, but let's see here. So talked about that, talked about the invisible ink. So the next thing I noticed about this book was the personification. She humanized a lot of inanimate objects in the book. And I think it was something where she connected nature to man, because all of the things that she brought life to were things of nature, whether it was an avocado, whether it was a tree, whether it was the water with the water lady who kind of guided Son on his way to keep him from being swept under in the current. There were so many moments where she gave life to something that could not breathe. And I didn't quite understand. I don't know if it was something that I tried to understand. It was just something that I noticed throughout the book. Where she was bringing all of these characters to life, or not all of these characters, but all of these inanimate objects, she was giving life to them. And I wonder if that was a connection to, once again, the tar baby, this inanimate object that changed Brer Rabbit forever. You know what I mean? Just like with, hey Dana, just like with Jadine, who, whose son could not release himself from. So I wonder if there was a connection there. But speaking of the inanimate objects, some of the things that I noted, I just mentioned the water, I just mentioned the avocado trees listening. They were judging Jadine's words, folding themselves as she leaves the room, you know what I mean? But the biggest one that I thought, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, was the part of the whole pivotal moment where I think Jadine became as attached to Son as he was already attached to her. And that was when she was stuck in the swamp. And was it a swamp that she was in, or was she stuck in tar? I don't know. But it was made to, it read like she was stuck in a swamp, but she couldn't get the stuff off of her. They needed to get turpentine. It tore her clothes off. And so I wonder if she actually stepped in a tar pit. Oh, Dana. Thanks, girl. Messed up my train of thought. So I wonder if she actually got stuck in a tar pit, and this was like the birth of the tar baby. Maybe I'm looking too deep into it. I don't know. But it was something about how when she went into this tar pit / swamp, I'm going to say a tar pit because it makes it sound more poetic. She stepped into this tar pit and she's starting to sink, and she's grasping with this, she's fighting, grabbing onto stuff to save herself basically because she's sinking. And she starts doing this dance with a willow tree. And the branches of the willow tree were women that were watching them dance, this tree and this woman. And they're thinking it's beautiful until she realized the branches, until they realize that she's trying to get away from them, not dancing with them. And I thought that was so beautiful. But I also thought, as she's sinking in this tar pit, and the only way to set herself free is to have her clothes ripped from her in this moment, was that the moment that the tar baby was born, that she was stripped of everything that made her look down on other people, or anything that made her feel like she was better than or in a different class. Was that the moment that all of that was stripped from her and that tar baby was born? I don't know. Maybe I'm looking too deeply into it, but that's what I got from that. And it was also after the moment where Son and Jadine were they having a picnic? They were doing something. Were they in a field? I don't remember exactly what was going on. I think maybe they were having a picnic, or they were together. They were in the woods. Let's just go with that. And they were having, he was charming her, and you could tell because the whole time she was trying to will herself to not feel anything toward this man that was effectively seducing her. And she was only fooling herself because, I could feel it just reading it. She was invested. So at this moment where they're talking, and he is saying to her, if you don't want me to touch you, I'm not going to touch you. He said, but all I want to do is touch the sole of your foot with this finger. And if you don't tell me to stop, if you don't tell me to stop, I won't. But if you tell me to stop, I will. As he's slowly reaching toward her foot to touch the sole. Why are you laughing? The sole of her foot with his finger. And I interpreted that he didn't touch the sole, S-O-L-E, of her foot. He touched her soul in that moment when he touched her foot, because she felt that finger on her foot for the rest of the book. So that was the moment where I think Jadine was done, when he put that finger on her soul / soul. So that was the moment where I think Jadine fell in love with him. And when she got stuck in this tar pit and she was stripped of everything that she knew, and he found her dirty, covered in mud, dirt, tar, whatever it was, and exposed because the tar stripped her down to her underwear. And that's how he found her. And from there on out, that was it. They were hand in hand ever since. So I think that was the moment when the tar baby was born. Going back to my notes here. So this book had a lot to do with differences in classes. I think Toni Morrison really did not neglect the fact that every relationship there was a separation of classes, where there was not only a separation, but there was also a lot of confusion. So stepping away from Jadine and Son for a second, we look at the other relationships where you have Valerian and Margaret Street, who moved to the islands from Philadelphia. Valerian made his wealth from being a candy maker. He moved from Philadelphia to the islands with his wife, and there was a son that we don't, well, not son, but their son, Michael, that never came to visit them very often. And there was always this obvious tension between husband and wife. That's always present, but it never really dug into that. And then you also have Ondine and Sydney, who I mentioned earlier, who are obviously the butler and the cook, and have worked for the streets for 40 some odd years. But it is not a typical, thank you, Shoshana. It is not a typical relationship between master and servant. So if you're thinking back to, if you're understanding that time where if you have a white family that owns this plantation basically on an island, and you have these servants working for you, you would not typically expect the type of conversations to take place between master and servant that took place between the streets and Sydney and Ondine. Christmas dinner was a prime example. Things went wrong to the point where Ondine slapped Margaret. They yelled at one another, they cursed one another, physically fought one another, and were ultimately told that they no longer worked there. And this was simply because, not simply, but it was because the yard man, who had also been with the family for probably decades, the yard man, as the streets called him, because it wasn't important enough to know his name was Gideon. And Son was the only person that acknowledged that. I don't even remember if Ondine and Sydney called him Gideon. I think they also called him Yard Man. There was a message there as well. If you're, the help, we don't need to know your name. We call you by what you do. Yard Man was fired because supposedly he had stolen some apples. Because Margaret wanted to cook this traditional Christmas dinner because she thought her son was finally coming back home to the islands, and she wanted to give him a traditional Christmas dinner like you have in the States, which included turkey and apple pie. Apparently things that were hard to come by in the islands, because they had to search far and wide. They had to go to the consulate to get apples. And they ended up cooking a goose instead of a turkey. But that's really not relevant. But anyway, so they got these apples to make this apple pie. Long story short, Valerian caught Yardman red-handed with some apples, because he wanted apples too for his own Christmas dinner, I guess. And his only defense was that he was putting them back. He wasn't stealing them. He was putting them back. And for whatever reason, he had the apples. Valerian fired him and didn't tell Ondine, the cook. And this sparked this huge argument as they all sat together at the Christmas dinner table. This sparked this huge argument because Valerian didn't tell Ondine or didn't consult with her about firing Yardman, because they would have done it themselves. So right here, it's awkward and it's uncomfortable because you kind of got to remember who's who at this table, because they're supposed to be the cook and the butler, but they're sitting at the table breaking bread and demanding that the man of the house, the owner of the home, the owner of the property, chastising him because they didn't tell him. He didn't tell them that he fired one of his employees. So right there's a lot of confusion. And it establishes that this is not a typical master-servant relationship. And from there, it escalates up to and including Ondine saying, Margaret, Valerian's wife, is not the woman of the house. This is my house. And she said that. So, yeah, there is the separation of classes, but it most certainly wasn't a typical relationship. And even then, when you fast forward to the end, when Valerian is very ill, Ondine and Sydney are still there, taking very good care of both Margaret and Valerian. Oops, what? Did I spoil something? I'm sorry. They're still taking very good care of them. So even though they were fired, oh yeah, you gotta read it. Even though they were fired, apparently they stayed on the whole time. But it also what came out at this Christmas dinner was why the son Michael never came home. All the tea was spilled in this dinner. The son Michael never came home because Ondine, in her argument with Margaret, started telling her, I know what you did, don't make me tell, I know what you did. And apparently Margaret was abusing baby Michael, sticking pins on him and doing all of these things to make him cry. Oh yeah, she did. She said that. Sticking pins in him, doing all of these things to hurt this child, and continue to do it to the point where he couldn't even cry about it anymore. He just took it. And when you're as a child, when things are done like that, even if it's something obviously not to that extent, but if you're being, I don't know, if you're beaten as a child, you know what I mean? You probably think at some point that is what happens to everybody. That's what happens in everybody's home until you realize that it doesn't. And then you grow up and resentment settles in and all of these things. You probably don't have the best relationship with, the people that did that to you after that. And that's what's happening with Michael. And Ondine is just basically putting all of Margaret's business out in the street, that this is why your boy did not come home. This is why we are sitting here and arguing that Yardman stole these apples for an apple pie that you wanted to make for somebody that was never going to eat it. And you fired them because they worked for you all these years and all they wanted was some apples of their own, and you fired them. And it was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. But it didn't undo that relationship and the dependency that these two married couples had on one another. Not necessarily each other, but on one another. So that was very interesting. And it also, speaking of relationships, well, let me not jump to that yet. The other part of that was the distinction in classes between Sun and Jadine. Donna says, yes, I agree. You think it's normal and the same for all regarding Michael's thought. Yeah. And then he grows up and he doesn't. He realized it wasn't normal. But what got me too was that Margaret really thought he would come back after all that she did to him. So somehow maybe she thought it was okay, or maybe I don't know. It was never truly explained. Yeah, she did. She did need him to forgive her. But that's the funny thing with people that do harm to one another. You want their forgiveness as you mature, as you age, but you don't ask for forgiveness with the same, at the same time that you need to accept accountability. So she was asking for forgiveness, but wasn't vocalizing or acknowledging what she needed to be forgiven for, and that in and of itself is unforgivable. You know what I mean? You have to acknowledge the role you played in it, before you can fix the damage that's done. So even with Jadine and Sun, two very different worlds. And Sun wanted nothing more than to pull Jadine into his world, and she wanted nothing more than to pull him into hers. But what was very clear was that they wanted to be in the same world together. And they tried living in New York. And there was this whole thing between Jadine doing her thing and being, the breadwinner and going to these photo shoots and all of these things that are exciting and metropolitan. And Son is just picking up odd jobs where he can, because that's all he can do. And the whole time he's talking about, come back to Elo, come back to Elo, in southern Florida with me, come back down south with me, and live in my world. And eventually they do. They go back to Elo, not to live, but they go to Elo to visit. Was it a visit or was it something specific? I think something, I don't remember if it was a specific event, but they went to Elo, and it was a hot mess. It was a hot mess because, you know, there was the whole pressure of they're not married, but they want to sleep in the same room. You know, Jadine sleeps in the nude, and she's getting judged by Aunt Rose, Aunt Ruth, whatever, Auntie, getting judged by Auntie because she sleeps in the nude, and she had to say, "Oh no, I forgot my night clothes," and she gives her something to sleep in, and the whole time she feels like she's being watched by, you know, spirits of Son's past, and being judged on how she loves him or how she presents herself, and she's just constantly trying to be enough, like she's not good enough there. So it's kind of like the roles were reversed. In Elo, she didn't feel like she was doing everything that she should be, or that she didn't feel comfortable. I might be making it more difficult than it needs to be. She didn't feel comfortable, and neither did Son in New York. And ultimately it came to a head when they started arguing, and finally attacking one another for not being what the other wanted them to be. And Son punched her. Go back to Tar Baby. Go back to the original Tar Baby. That was a pivotal moment in that story, just as it was a pivotal moment in this story. But it didn't lead to him being stuck to her. He was already stuck to her. She was the air he breathed. This was the moment that he actually became detached from her. And that was their undoing, where they both knew that there was a role that they played in it. She took off and went back to the islands, and he stayed in New York. And he waited for her to come back. He sat patiently and waited and waited and waited for a week, until he said, "Nope, she's not coming back. I got to go and get her." So she went back to the island. And in that week's time, she had this obligation that she felt she needed to spend as much time with Margaret as she did with Ondine, keeping in mind Margaret and Valerian were the reason that she was exposed to so many things in the world, that she had seen some of the things that she did, you know, that gave her that air about her, you know, where she felt she rose above her circumstances. They were her benefactors because of that relationship with her aunt and her uncle, who she called Nanadine. Ondine she called Nanadine, and her uncle was Sydney. So there was a lot of obligation that she felt to spend as much time with Margaret as she would spend with her aunt. And in this moment where she returned home, and keeping in mind, she just took up and left with Son. She barely said goodbye, but it was obvious that she ran off with him. So Ondine was feeling resentful that she left like that, and that she didn't check on them, and that she didn't, you know, care to see how they were. She had a lot of resentment about that. And when she returned to the islands and she spent some time with Ondine, and then she said, "I'll be back, I have to go see Margaret." And, you know, she went and spent some time with Margaret. It was during this time that Ondine, alone with her thoughts, decided she needed to say something to Jade. And this was another pivotal moment in the book, where we're looking at the theme surrounding relationships. This one was deep for me, personally. When Jade came back in the room with Ondine, Ondine acknowledged the fact, number one, that her mother, Jade's mother, she goes by Jade in the book, so I might say Jade or Jadine, they're the same person. But she's acknowledging, I know your mother wasn't in your life, you know. And Jade was at this point mentally. She just broke up with the love of her life. She was drained emotionally, and she's thinking and eventually says out loud, please don't ask me right now to take care of you or to give me something that I need to do for you, because I don't have it in me right now to give anything to anybody. This is what she's thinking in this moment. And you know that moment, you know, when you're just drained and I'm like, look, I'm barely holding it together. Just, I need a minute. That's basically what she was saying. And Ondine comes back to her and she said, no, I'm not making this about taking care of me, but I need you to understand something, because I never told you this and you need to know this. And she said that you have to learn how to be a daughter. Even though your mother wasn't in your life, even though your mother wasn't present in your life, you have to learn how to be a daughter. Because if you don't, you will never know how to be a wife. You will never know how to be a mother. You will never know how to be a friend to another woman. Because if you do not understand or feel the obligation to take care of those that took care of you, you will never earn the respect of anybody else whose life you play a role in. When I tell you I had to stop, I had to lean back, I had to take a deep breath, I had to put my hands in my head in my hands and pull myself together, because that was, I had to peel that statement apart like an onion. Yes, it's still with me. It's always going to stay with me. I had to peel that apart like an onion, because she is saying it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what relationship you have with your mother. If you don't take the time to understand what it means to be a daughter, meaning that regardless of what relationship you have with your mother, if you don't understand that lifelong obligation that you have to return to those that have invested in you and made you who you are, how in the world are you ever going to be able to expect that of somebody else? Be it a wife, be it a husband, be it a child, be it a girlfriend. You will never get it, because you never got it. Tore me apart, because I know about those estranged relationships, and that's all I have to say about that. But I know about that, and I know how somebody who doesn't have that bond with their mother, how that affects other relationships. And if that wasn't some truth Toni put on those pages, I don't know what was. Not to say that I 100% agree with the obligation part, but I 1000% agree that it affects every single relationship that will ever touch you. That was some truth that she spoke. And that man, this book, I got so much more out of it than I thought I would in those first 4 chapters. I'm here to tell you, I didn't think I would make it. But that right there was something. Whew, I got fired up over that part. Where are we? And I think I touched on everything that I had in my notes. One thing I did write down, because they were talking about it, when it feels like you're talking to me, I'm talking to me too. And I know you understand that. Yeah, I know you understand that, and I understand it just as well as you do. So yeah, that was deep. I wrote this down because at the end, when Valerian was ill, and there was the whole moment between him and Sydney, where Valerian, obviously he was never the same after he realized that Margaret was abusing his son. Their relationship was never the same, and the feeling that I got was that he blamed Margaret which he should have, he blamed Margaret for losing his son because his son never came back after that. And their relationship was a mess after that. And it sounds like emotionally and physically he fell apart, started to slowly deteriorate. Not only that, but also his land, his property, his business. And that was something that Sidney kept coming back to as Valerian was reminiscing over Michael and saying, you know what, I'm going to go back to the States. I'm going to find him. We're going to fix this. And meanwhile, you know, he's saying this while he can't even feed himself and his hands are shaking. And it's very clear that he is become a feeble elder who needs care. And Sidney is providing that care. And I think it's almost going back to that moment with Ondine and Jadine where she was saying, you have to understand that obligation. You have to feel that obligation to take care of somebody else, regardless of how they treated you, but due to the role that they played in you becoming who you are. So it seems to me that maybe Sidney and Ondine felt an obligation to take care of Margaret and Valerian, and Sidney, who is not entertaining Valerian's wild thoughts of going back to Philadelphia and going back to the States, because obviously he can't. But as he spoon feeds his baked potato to him and feeds him, he promises him that he will always be taken care of. And that was a powerful moment, and I think that kind of brought home what Ondine was saying, that even though she as her aunt may not be her mother, the people that took care of you, you have to feel that obligation, because otherwise you're always going to struggle in relationships. He probably did share the blame, because if it happened under his nose in his home, he's probably thinking, why didn't I see it? Why didn't I do something? How could she do that? How could he not tell me? So he's probably not only blaming her as his wife, but he's judging himself as a father for not seeing it and doing something about it so he could help his son. He even asked Sidney, it was not kind of sad, it was very sad. He was like, do you think he's okay? And, you know, sometimes these books, I know this happened with The Warmest December, when I read The Warmest December by Bernice McFadden. Some of the things that these authors write, I have to believe it is coming from some sort of personal experience. Because in my personal life, I speak, it's not a secret, when my brother was 19 years old, he was, complete sidebar, so please just bear with me. It's coming back to what I'm telling you. He went to Tuskegee, and he came home one Christmas, and I remember we got into this horrible argument. He and I got into this horrible argument, and it was on this night. It was the last time I ever told my brother that I loved him, because we were arguing back and forth, and my father was there. My parents were divorced at the time. So my father had come back to my mother's house where I still lived. I was like 17 at the time. And my brother and I were arguing, and my father sat us both down on the sofa, and he was like, you guys, you are brother and sister, you have to do better than this. And my brother was so angry at me, and I don't remember what it was about, but he was so angry. And he was saying stuff like, you don't love me, you don't love me. And I was like, I do love you. You're my brother. I love you. And I remember this so clearly because of what happened the next day. And that was the last moment I ever told my brother that I loved him. The next day, my brother went to my father's house, who lived at the time in the next town over. He was a 10-minute drive. And he walked there. My brother walked to my father's house, and we both had keys. And he let himself in. And basically, my father wasn't home at the time, but when he did come home, he basically ambushed him. And he stabbed him several times and bludgeoned him with a hammer and attempted to kill him, obviously. And this was a moment where you don't know, you don't know what to do with it. You don't know what to do with any of that I just told you. You probably don't even know what to do with what I just told you. So I certainly didn't know what to do with it either. But fast forward, my brother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was locked up for 2 years. He came out, and 5 days later, he committed suicide. And my father, who, God bless him, I just lost him 3 years ago. As he would say it, he's lived on borrowed time ever since then. And that was 1993. No, it happened in 91. It was 93 when my brother killed himself. But my father, we had an estranged relationship up until that moment. And as this moment unfolded where my father was healing mentally and emotionally, and I was by his side, we found one another and our relationship formed, that we kept for the rest of his life. And I remember he asked me one day, we were just talking, and he asked me out of the blue why my brother did what he did to him. And I told him. And he asked me that in the same exact tone that I would imagine Valerian used when he said, "Is he okay?" And that came from a place where you not only have guilt and remorse, but you also have unconditional love. And that's how I received that question from Valerian, "Is he okay?" Where at the end of the day, he didn't want to go to Philadelphia and see his son. He just needed validation that his boy survived that and that he would be okay. In the same space that my father asked, why did he do it? When he knew. And I knew. And we all knew, that there was a history that led up to that moment. Thank you, Dana. I'm good. And so is he. He's at peace. So that's why I say when authors find it in themselves to write their characters in a certain way or to say things in a certain way, it is coming from an experience. Whether it was their experience, whether it was the experience of someone that they loved, it comes from a personal experience. And that moment where, Valerian was kind of talking out of his head and Sydney was just basically saying, don't worry about it. We've got you. We've got you. That it was just a powerful moment. There are a lot of powerful, powerful moments in this book. To the point where I said to my husband, I'm going back to read this again. After this year, because Donna's got our whole year booked with Morrison and McFadden and all the things, I'm going to have to read it after this year is over. Because I don't have time to read anything else. But I'm going to have to go back and read Tar Baby, because I think this slowly wiggled its way into being one of my all-time favorites. Just because of the symbolism and the meaning and the message and these little gems that are hidden in the pages that, I got all of that from one reading. What am I going to get from 2 or 3? So if you guys haven't read this book, read this book. But I think you should go back to read the original Tar Baby from the Uncle Remus stories. It's literally a 5-minute read. But yeah, I gotta read it again, definitely. Donna just said I read it every 2 to 3 years, and each time it's a new. I believe you, because I know I missed some gems in there. But yeah, go back and read the original Uncle Remus story, just so you understand what Toni's muse was, what her inspiration is, and then go and read this book and share that experience of how she transformed that 5-minute story into this masterpiece. And I think, thank you, Shoshana. I think this was probably, like I said earlier, one of those books where when you get it, takes you a while to get there with that invisible ink, but when you get it, you got it for the rest of your life, just like that Tar Baby. You stuck to it. Yeah, she knocked the ball out of the park with this one. So, that being said, it's 9:55. Yeah, nothing like it. Nothing like it. That being said, thank you for sharing this space with me today. Thank you, Donna, for putting this together. I just told my husband the other day, I'm so grateful for this group because I'm committed, obviously, fully committed to doing the Year of Morrison, and it kind of not only allows me to reread or read for the first time some of her masterpieces, but it really forces me to pick it apart mentally so I can speak to it intelligently. Even though I think I struggled with Song of Solomon, that was still a tough one. But this book, I'm so grateful that this platform introduced me or reintroduced me to this book. I got a lot out of this one. Yeah, Donna just said, I'm so glad you shared about the initial Tar Baby. I totally overlooked or forgot about that story. Go back and listen to it. And I don't know if you were here for the very beginning, but I basically recapped it, and you can really see the connection between those two stories. But she just put her old Morrison smack down on it and changed everything. But thank you so much, Donna, for this group and this platform, and for all of you guys, that share your posts and share your feedback and make this type of conversation so much more fun and rewarding. So next month I'm doing, you too, Dana. Next month I'm doing Beloved, but I'm also, I know Donna put a post up about the 12 Tribes of Hattie. I read this book when it first came out. I think it was when it first came out. And I think it was before Oprah made it a Book of the Month club. It was a Book of the Month book. It was something, me and one of my girlfriends, we kind of were in the library and we just saw it and we're like, oh, I'm going to read this. And it was, man, that was a good book. So somebody posted something about it and I was like, oh, I got to go back and read that one. And Donna said, well, hey, you want to talk about it? You want to do a discussion about it? And I would love to. So that's going to give me another reason to go back and read this book. But I wanted to put it out there just in case any of you guys wanted to read it, and I'll put a post out there. I know Donna's is already out there, but I'll put one out there too to remind you guys of the name of the book. But that was all I had tonight. I think this was so far my favorite book to talk about until we pick apart Beloved. So I hope everybody has a good evening and a great Wednesday and the rest of the week. And I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.